So we had an absolutely phenomenal story from you in the last episode, Nick. So if you're up for it, we're going to give you a bit of a few questions just to figure out how you got to the point where you can write like that.
I'm ready. Bring it on.
Well, he asked for it. What is the first book you remember reading and enjoying?
This is obviously I've listened to your podcast briefly before, and the last episode I listened to was when you interviewed Dave Goodman, who's a friend of mine, and I actually work with him a bit, kind of writing critique group and things like that. He said The Hobbit, and you guys chat about Tolkien for a while, and coming on here, I didn't want to be cliche, but it's going to be Tolkien because it has to be. I think I couldn't say anything else. But it's actually The Lord of the Rings. Is the first book I specifically remember being like, wow, this is something. This is a world that I'm lost in.
If we've done anything in our 100+ episodes on this podcast, it is to prove that Tolkien is the heart of the modern writing community, because roughly 90% of people mention or directly say it is Tolkien in this answer. But I'm absolutely fascinated to find out what's the key threads in that you remember from the first time that you read it that might still be casting a shadow on the way that you write.
So I mean, obviously, I read books before. The Lord of the Rings was not the first book I've ever read, by any means. And I read books before that and things like that. But if I have to cast back and think what they actually were, and put a name to them, God, I'm not sure I could, because I did read it quite early. I didn't actually read The Hobbit beforehand, as most people do. I don't know why. I think I found a copy of The Lord of the Rings at, I think it was like some charity jumble sale type thing that my parents had dragged me along to because they were volunteering about something, and I was bored and didn't want to be there, and found this huge copy, and it had this beautiful cover that entranced.
I was going to say the cover. Whenever you go to these kind of places and find versions of the books, there's always different covers, and you associate it so strongly with that first cover that you get. I always think it's such an important thing. So please continue.
But it really was. It really captured me. And it was really lovely and fantastical, but in that old kind of I think it was probably a book from the 80s or something like that, so or 70s. It was quite an old style to it. And I picked it up and I wanted it, and I was quite young at this point, so I must have been in year 4, right? So 9 or something like that. And so it was a huge chunky book. I'd never read a book that long before, anywhere near that long before. But I got it. I took it home. I started reading it, and I specifically remember the little poem at the beginning about the rings. One ring to rule them all. But the rings for the dwarven kings and rings for the elves and all of that kind of stuff.
I can do it if you want, but it just proves I'm a loser.
I'm going to embarrass myself to say that I can't do it off by heart, but please do it. Put me in the moment.
It's 5 from the Elven Lords under the sky, 3 for the Dwarf Lords in the Halls of Stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, and 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie.
So that was wonderful, Nick, but it was an absolutely shit Kate Blanchett impression.
I cannot be that A, good at acting, or B, glorious and beautiful.
Terrible
and beautiful. So it was. I remember reading that and just I don't know. I've not read anything quite like that before. That completely transported me to another world, and so I read it. It took me about a year to read The Fellowship of the Ring, because I was quite young and took it at a pace. But I just completely lost and entranced it, and that absolutely was the birth my love of fantasy. I mean, by the time I'd finished reading The Lord of the Rings, I was basically like going to my parents and just being like, give me anything like that, like right now. Inject it directly into my veins.
Some sort of child crack. It's
Yeah,
fantasy crack. Yeah.
yeah. Tolkien got me fully addicted to fantasy crack. And that was basically me up until like I hit puberty. Essentially, was just like lost in this world of fantasy books. And yeah, so it was partly why I talked about when I started writing. Wanting to write full novels, I was drawn back to fantasy because it very much felt like the starting point in my love of fiction. But I think from that, I got this kind of just interest in anything fantastical, really. Anything slightly different, anything slightly crazy or weird. And then later on with, my dad is really into sci-fi. And so he introduced me to a much more so than fantasy. He doesn't really read fantasy very much. Doesn't really like a lot of fantasy, actually. But he was kind of simultaneously pushing kind of Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke and people like that at me at the same time. And so I had this quite broad range of kind of speculative grounding. But definitely The Lord of the Rings is the one that stands out to me as like, what's that first book that you remember really just absolutely loving?
That's a solid answer.
Cool. Right, so when you're writing, do you have what we would call writing props around you to give you that little bit of extra inspiration?
Not in the slightest. I'm an interesting one in that I like. I think it comes from the fact that I have quite a busy life and often not very many opportunities to just find somewhere to sit down in the quiet and write. I've got I'm a teacher and I teach full time, and I also I have two little kids. I've got a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and just lots of other busy things going on. So I don't really have like a kind of writing space. I always find I'm sneaking writing into the margins. I'm sneaking it into kind of like a little bit of time I might have at work, or a little bit of time like, I don't know, if I'm on a train or something, or things like that. I got very good at that, and because of that, I never really have a dedicated writing space or a writing zone. I'm quite good at just being like, yeah, I'm going to write now. I'm going to write, and so I've not even made one for myself because I almost feel like there's no point. Like I could set up a kind of writing office with a desk and things like that. I did actually in my last flat. I set up a little desk kind of and put some like nice fancy hardbacks that I really loved and tried to make it a kind of what people would imagine a nice writing desk would be. I never wrote at it. I wrote on the sofa in the other room. I wrote like about I never actually sat at it and wrote anything there. Yeah, I'm a very nomadic writer, which doesn't tend to lead itself to having props, because I'd have to carry them around in a backpack, and that would be a waste of time.
So a bare room basically would also work for you just as well as actually probably better than, yeah. Really
matter either way. I tend to blank things out a little bit around me when I get into writing. So it wouldn't really matter if there was anything there or not.
So you are teaching full time. Are you you're a lecturer, correct?
I'm an English teacher. I'm a high school English teacher.
High school English teacher, wonderful. Do your students know that you have published books?
They do, yeah. Some of them ask me about it. Some of them have read it. Some of them have read some of my work. It's really funny actually. So some obviously, as anyone who's read my work and anyone who wants to read my work will discover, they're quite adult. Not just in kind of the way that they're written, but they deal with some pretty heavy themes. And there's a lot of, death and horror and things like that going on in them. They're not, necessarily great reads for younger children. Not that I would, I was reading some pretty adult stuff when I was very, very young, and many kids do. But my first book, Professor Everywhere, is quite niche in its kind of literary style. I do lots of pretentious, weird things, like it's written like a memoir that's written from an academic, and so it's got these footnotes to made up kind of scientific papers. There's a whole chapter that's like describing the events of something through a film that's made by a fictional filmmaker that exists within world, and all of these kind of weird things, right? And I definitely have kids who are like in like a S1 class, so they're like 11, 12 years old, who are like, oh my God, my English teacher is a writer. I'm going to get one of his books and read it. Oh, he writes like fantasy. That's so cool. Expecting to, I don't know, pick up the Hunger Games. And you can see that they read the first chapter and they're like, I am so baffled. Like, it's not even that it's like too much for them. It's just they're like, this is boring. And I'm like, sorry, man, I didn't write it for you. Like,
you'll get it when you're older, kids.
Yeah, come back to me later.
Well,
But some of the older kids have read some of my stuff. One of them read, a couple of them have read an Arc of Ascension, actually, because I had it with me and really enjoyed it. So that was quite nice.
Fascinating.
well,
Interesting
no,
to get
only off the back of stuff. You know, off the back of that, I'm going to call you sir for the rest of this interview. So, sir, what gives you satisfaction when you're writing, sir?
That's really freaking me out, man.
It's freaking me out as well. What's funny about that is people don't really do that in Scotland. So I live in Edinburgh and I teach in Edinburgh, and I grew up outside the UK. I didn't move to. I know I'm not answering your question at all, but it's fine. I've gone off on a second. I'll come back to it. But I grew up outside of the UK. I didn't move to the UK to England until I was 18, so I never called anyone sir, and people don't tend to call me sir. But occasionally, you've got a kid who will come up from England to, like, they've moved to Scotland or whatever, and they'll be like sir, and I'll be like, that's weird. Stop that. We don't do that here. Call me by my name.
It really, really strange at school when teachers would like basically enforce that, and because and it would almost become like a passive aggressive thing to use someone's first name when you were referring to a teacher.
I did it every time.
Yeah, no, I did a lot as well, and I got in a lot of trouble for it. It's just, but you sort of see them getting wound up about something so completely inconsequential. It's very, I don't know. I went to a shit school though, so maybe that's why.
There's a lot of interesting discussion about kind of the power dynamics between teachers and kids and all of that kind of thing. But yeah, I think sir is a bit silly, and people call me. I'm like, I'm not a knight. Stop it. Anyway, what gives me satisfaction when I'm writing? Was that the question?
It was, yeah.
That was a while ago.
Yeah.
I'm circling back. What gives me satisfaction? God, all of it. I don't know. I love writing. I really love it. I love drafting more than editing. I really love just sitting down and seeing where a story takes me. I know there's this big debate between kind of like plotters and pantsers or whatever you want to call them, and I think everyone, it's not one or the other. Everyone's somewhere on a spectrum, right? But I
was just about to follow up there. Just say, like, is there that much of a debate? Like, I know people sort of like self-define or say that they're on the spectrum and stuff, but I don't know whether there is. I've never actually seen anyone argue for what they do over what somebody else does, if that makes sense. Like, I know you spend a lot of time in writing groups. Do you actually have situations where, like, a pantser is like, what are you doing planning everything? How can you possibly be creative? And then
I don't think a debate in that sense. I think everyone accepts that everyone's got their own way, but I think people do self-categorize as plotters and pantsers, and I think that, and maybe they are, but I think that the writing process is generally much more of a mix of that than people tend to
agreed, yeah.
And to think when they talk about it in that kind of categorization. I probably lean more towards the pantser. I'm much more of a discovery writer, so I'll have some threads in mind and I'll kind of have a sense of where I'm going, but but things change very quickly, and a lot of it is exploring the story. And so I really enjoy that. I really like writing a story and seeing where it goes. And often I won't know where it will go until I've got there, and my mind will throw out some weird thing, and I'll be like, "Oh God, that's weird. Yeah, I'm not right about that. That's really fucked up. I'm gonna put that in." And I'll enjoy and just enjoy kind of seeing that come to fruition. Is really quite nice.
That idea of the discovery in your writing being the bit that gets you the satisfaction that of the writing process. I think I strongly identify with that, and I can sort of hear from the way that you're talking about it that it's almost like a need for you to write stories. Am I right?
Yeah, definitely.
Mm.
And I think the actual act of writing it, rather than just thinking about stories, makes the story itself so much more. You discover so much more about the story as you're writing it, right? And it becomes so much more fleshed out and interesting. There are you meet a lot of people. I've met a lot of people who, the people that you meet that are kind of like, I bet I could write a novel, and they've never written more than a paragraph in their life, and they seem to enjoy the concept of stories, and they think about stories a lot, but they don't actually want to write a lot of it, or they find it quite difficult to, or they find it quite a struggle to get a lot of it down, and you get a lot of these ideas about writer's block, I suppose, coming from that. I don't know. I can consciously and truthfully say I don't think I've ever experienced writer's block. I'm not sure I know what it is. I'll just, if I don't really know where a story is going, I'm like, that's fine. I'm just going to keep writing and see where it ends up. It might not be very good, and I'll delete it later. That's fine. But like, just let it flow and just enjoy that discovery of the process.
I think that's a really fascinating talking point, that because this idea of writer's block could actually be summed up by sort of defining it as a prolonged period of procrastination. That like fear response that people get when they know they want to do something or they know they have to do something and they don't do it. And then it builds and builds and builds, and the pressure gets to the point where their mind is blank.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I've always thought that's what writer's block is. And it's really interesting to have you basically, it sounds like potentially confirm that, because you can always just type, just bash your head against the keyboard.
Yeah.
This idea of a blank page, I feel like it's nonsense to a large degree. I will say that like when I'm trying to actually write, there are times when I pause when I'm writing, but that's not.
Yeah.
That's fine to have a little bit of cogitation around it is fine, but this idea of just like a blankness, like a wall coming down in front of you.
I think there's a kind of like set of manacles people put on themselves, right? So they'll say, I have writer's block because I'm trying to write insert book concept and I don't know what to do with it next. Well, no, you haven't got writer's block. You've got that story needs a minute to cogitate block.
Yeah, percolate almost.
Write
Yeah.
something else. Yeah, like go and write what you imagine Aragorn's shopping list at Asda would be, or a poem, or a song, or try and use the punctuation on your keyboard to draw a man in a silly hat. Like,
so just Aragorn's shopping list, right? That's going to be dominated with Hobbit food supplies, isn't it? It's going to be
yeah,
like
it's nothing for him.
Yeah, there's like one packet of jerky for him right at the end.
Or
Everything
lembas.
else,
Like,
yeah.
Just you look at it, it's like all the ingredients to make a breakfast, and then in a different pen ×2 written next to all of them. Right, I'm going to give you a toughie now. This is an even one. What's your favourite novel?
Oh, it is an evil one. This is really not very nice at all.
That's us. Sorry.
I'm gonna have to commit to one though. It's even if it might not be true tomorrow. House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski.
What about that really sort of opens it up in your mind?
I don't have either of you ever read it by any chance? I don't know if
No, so really do sell it to me, because I'm gonna.
Okay. It's absolutely bonkers. It's this book, essentially the the elevator pitch of the book is basically it's a book about a house that's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. It's a TARDIS house. But it's written as a horror, and it's written about this family who move in, and it's just this slow creeping horror as like the obsession, like the husband, he's measuring something, like he's trying to work out something, and to put up something on a wall, and he measures the inside wall and he measures the outside wall, and the inside wall is like 2 inches larger than the outside wall, and he's just like, well, I've clearly made a measuring mistake, right? That doesn't work. And he does it again, and he does it again, and he gets his brother round, and his wife's just like, just, would you leave it alone? Like, will you stop like obsessing over it? And he can't, because how could you, right? If you keep doing that, how could you possibly stop obsessing over that? And it just, things get weirder and weirder and weirder. There's this wonderful moment in it, and it's stuck with me forever, as a peak of horror. It's basically it's a horror book, where so this couple, they've moved into this house, right? And there's the wall inch thing, which is bothering this guy and is bothering us as a reader slightly, and then blah blah blah. They wake up, they go to bed one night, and they wake. So imagine you're in your bedroom, you go to bed one night in your house. You've lived in it for a while, your kids are in the other room, you're all kind of settled in, and you wake up the next day, and in the room there is a door that wasn't there when you went to bed. And it's just a perfectly normal door. And it looks like it probably should have been always there. But you and your wife both absolutely swear that 100% it was not there when you went to bed, right? And even you open it up and it's just like, I don't know, it's a walk-in wardrobe or something. It's a little cupboard. It's not.
That's really
It's not
disquieting.
something, right?
Yeah.
But it's so like, could you go to sleep in that room again?
No.
Could you?
It's
And
horror
like,
in this thing.
yeah, and it's just, there's so many little disquieting elements, and it just gets weirder and weirder and weirder and stranger, and then this house gets worse and worse, and but the whole thing is told in the most absolutely bonkers way. I can't even begin to explain it. You should Google image House of Leaves and have a look at some of the graphological things that Danielewski does. Like, there are pages that are upside down, there are whole pages that are like crossed out, there are bits of it that are like footnotes leading to footnotes that are like then don't lead anywhere. There's the story is told by a narrator commenting on another narrator embedded in like another narrator that's telling a story about a film that he once saw. There's all sorts of crazy narrative things going on. It's a huge book. It's like 800 pages. And I read that book, and I've read it a couple of times since, but I read that book in a yurt in Mongolia. That's kind of sideways to the story, but that's where I read it.
We are going to have to ask you about your travels at some point, because that sounds amazing. And the way that you described Moscow in your story before, I'm assuming you've been there as well.
I haven't actually been to Moscow.
Right. Okay.
That was pure Google Maps and images. That was creating that piece of work. But I have been to a lot of places. And I was in a yurt in Mongolia when I read this book. And God, that was terrifying, because I was in the middle of nowhere, and it was the middle of night, and it was very dark. And I was reading by like firelight. But the first time I read the book, it completely redefined what a novel was capable of being. I had kind of this structure in my head of like, this is a novel, this is how books work. Yes, people can do creative things, and people could do interesting things with structure and all of these kinds of things. And I read House of Leaves, and I came out the end of it, and Danielewski just like took a massive shotgun and blew everything I thought out of the water. And he was like, you can do all of this. And I went, wow, like, I'm not going to do all of that, because this book is absolutely fucking bonkers, but I could do some of it, or I could just, it helped me see that I could be more inventive in the way that I write, in a way that no other book has ever done.
I'm sold.
It sounds like the kind of creeping dread horror that Junji Ito writes. A
little bit.
Yeah, like things that, or at least the early parts of his stories before they go mental. When it's just wrong enough that you're like, this makes me very uncomfortable.
Just wrong enough is a really good way to phrase that, I think. Just from what I've heard about it there. This idea of that sort of disquieting thing that we were all talking about, just wrong enough for it to be just at the edge of perception is horrible.
Yeah.
Like that feeling of being like you feel like somebody's behind you and then you turn and they're not there.
You're not screaming, you're not running away from it,
Yeah.
you're not, you're not being chased or anything like that, but you just feel really unsettled.
Yeah. Whatever it is at the edge of human perception that makes us feel that
Yeah.
that early ape with fearing jungle cats or whatever it is, somehow perfectly captured in weird prose. Love it. Oh, I love it. So, you mentioned that you spent the first 18 years living abroad, and then you've also done quite a lot of traveling since then. I think, is that right? Or have you stayed in England
Yeah.
and Scotland since then?
No, so I grew up, I was born in Singapore, and
On a army base, or
no, my dad was a international school teacher.
right?
So I was working in an international school out in Singapore. And my mum was there working as a physiotherapist at the same time. And so I was born in Singapore, and then we moved to Switzerland when I was 6. Again, just moving to another school. So they always travel a lot. They continued to travel long after I left school as well. And then I was in Switzerland for a while, came to England for uni, did a couple of years of teaching after that in England, got itchy feet and moved to Hong Kong. So I lived out in Hong Kong for about 5 years. During that time, did a lot of traveling. My goal was to travel all of East Asia, to go to every single country in East Asia, which I did, bar 3.
Wow.
There were 3 countries that I never made it to, which were Laos, East Timor, and North Korea, because I didn't want to support the regime.
No one's fair.
But yeah, pretty much everywhere else, which was awesome. And then we had our son Oscar when we were out in Hong Kong, and after about a year of having him, and mixed up with various other things like the political situation in Hong Kong at the time, it was the kind of the anti-China protests and COVID and all sorts of other things going on. We decided that we wanted to move back a little bit closer to some of my wife's family and a little bit closer to home. So we moved to Edinburgh. Yeah.
Fascinating. Do you feel like the way that you've immersed yourself initially as a child and then also deliberately as an adult has changed the way that you look at stories?
Yeah, definitely. And I think experiencing a range of cultures has been really important to me in the way that I think about people and writing, both in the sense that it allows me to think about different ways of doing things to some degree, and I try deliberately to read a lot of work in translation, so literature from other cultures that have been translated into English, because again, just different ways of telling stories and different ways of writing things out of the kind of Anglophone tradition, which I think is really interesting. But also, I think the more I see of the world, the more I get a sense of what it is to be human. And that sounds like a very grand statement, but it almost feels like there's this big concept of like, this is what it means to be a human, of which is a huge set that encompasses so many millions of things. And the more of humanity you can see in all of its myriad of different forms, the more you can kind of whittle down into what that is. Like, what is the essential thing that connects us all? What is that common human experience? And I think seeing as much of the world as possible has helped me, or at least I hope it's helped me whittle down on that, because for me, ultimately, that's what we tell stories about. We tell stories about the universal human experience, or some aspect of the universal human experience.
I think that's a wonderful answer, and Do you feel like you might maybe when your kids are a bit older, you might go somewhere else, experience a bit more, or
Possibly. Yeah. Quite possibly. Quite probably actually. But that feels. I'm currently, especially with my book launch next month and things like that. I'm
Mm.
thinking almost 2 or 3 weeks ahead of myself at the moment. Certainly not several
I
years ahead of
yeah,
myself.
that's entirely fair. I mean, I struggle to live more than a few hours ahead at sometimes. Are there
Got a
any
book
cultures
coming out. You
in
still got
particular?
marketing to do, Ben.
Yeah, you still got marking. Yeah. Are there any
Yeah.
cultures in particular that you are sort of desperate to learn more about? Sort of.
I would like to spend more time in South America. I've not done that much. And I'm actually fascinated by South American literary traditions. I talked about magical realism earlier, and I
Mm.
think some of the um some of the more recent books coming out of kind of some South American writers are really fantastic. There's this author called Samantha Schweblin who is an Argentinian writer. And she wrote this book called Fever Dream. It's this horror book. I quite like her horror book, as you can probably tell. And it's just absolutely genius. It was another one of those books that really it really changed the way I thought about storytelling. So I'd like to actually go there and experience their culture a little bit more. And I'd like to see more of Africa. I've been to a bit of Africa, but not as much as I have Asia. It's places I haven't yet been, I suppose.
I'm just I'm really taken with the way that you with the way that you see humanity, see the world, and storytelling being an integral part of that. That feels like a very positive way to live one's life. So thank
Yeah,
you for expanding on that.
I feel like when we're talking about the kind of the essential human experience, that's the one thing that's everywhere, right? That's the one thing that all humans do. We tell stories,
Absolutely.
fictional stories. We tell non-fictional stories. We tell stories that are a blend of both. But it's something. It's the one thing that connects us all, really.
There's one other thing we all do, actually, which is music.
Mm.
Do you link music to your storytelling at all? Like, do you listen to music when you write? Do you listen to music from particular parts of the world to like
Times.
headspace writing or?
Well, it's one of those things where I think it helps to get me in the mood at the beginning. I like to listen like sometimes soundtracks or kind of instrumental music, certainly nothing with lyrics. And and that's good. But I tend to kind of like what I was talking about earlier, where it doesn't really matter where I am. I'll just kind of zone in on the writing. I tend to quite quickly get into a kind of zone where if I am listening to music, I just don't hear it anymore. I just kind of zone it out and I'm just in the writing. So often I end up just not listening to music because it doesn't really, I'll zone it out anyway.
I believe
I
they
like
call that
listening.
a flow state, don't they? When you're just so focused on the writing that you don't actually absorb anything else.
Yeah. Apparently I used to do that a lot as a kid, when I'd get really focused into things, particularly video games. So I'd be like playing a video game. My mum and my dad tell stories about they'd literally be like next to me, being like, Nick, Nick. And they wouldn't be there. Like I'd be so focused in what I was doing that I might as well have been in a different world. Like they had to like shake me out of it.
I fully support young Nick there because basically they needed to get more interesting fast in order to get your attention. Do you have a favorite video game?
Oh yeah, easy question.
Yeah, that's
And it's all
easy compared to the novel, really.
yeah,
It's gonna say
yeah.
Silent Hill 2.
It's it's not a horror one either. It's probably almost entirely nostalgia and almost entirely a game arriving at exactly the right point in my life. But Final Fantasy X.
That's
10.
fascinating. So I'm gonna have to hand this entirely over to Nico because I have absolutely no grasp on the Final Fantasy series.
10 is interesting as a. I'm not gonna argue with it. I'm actually not. But what is it about 10 specific? Like, have you gone back and played the earlier ones, and have you continued to play Final Fantasy?
I've played some of the early ones. I played, yeah, I've played 7. I played 8. I've played some of the ones since
Yeah.
12 was quite good. Or 11 rather.
Can I butt in here and ask, why is it contentious, Nico?
So it's an interesting one because when in inverted commas Final Fantasy fans, who I don't know if I'd really count myself in the number even, talk about it, it's normally 7 or 8 that gets brought up and sort of lauded as the best one, much like you'd get with Ocarina of Time if it was about Legend of Zelda. People, they've picked one and they're like, it's that one.
Right.
But 10 was a little bit, so it's in the PS2 era, so it was like there was such a wide spectrum of games that it wasn't like kind of up at the top like 7 and 8 were on the PS1 when there was less to pick from. And then 10 had a weird offshoot that was 10-2.
Yeah.
And it kind of marred the, because they were almost completely separate games apart from some characters.
And
if I remember
I
right.
actually I really dislike 10-2.
I think it's
Fascinating.
10-2 that has for loads of people made them go, wasn't 10 shit? And you're like, no,
No, 10-2 was
was definitely rubbish. But
exactly.
yeah, it's just,
I think
it's unusual to hear someone say like Final Fantasy X to the point that made me go, oh, that's interesting. So I liked it.
I think 10 has the best storytelling of any Final Fantasy game I've played, or of any game I've played, perhaps even. I think it's the best story, if not the best gameplay or other things, which it does fine. But I think the complexity of the world and the story, not just on a kind of like playing along the game level, but on a symbolism and meaning level, is the most complex and the most interesting, in my opinion.
Fascinating.
I reminded myself to edit in the Tidus laugh there.
Well, thanks for leading me through that, because I am a complete noob when it comes to Final Fantasy, so that was really interesting to hear about it. So when you are enjoying storytelling, are there any tropes of fiction that trip you up when they come up? Maybe a few times over the course of your sort of reading life, and you're just like, why does this keep coming? Why do storytellers keep using this trope? It's shit. What's your least enjoyable trope?
I read a bit of partly because when it's done really well, I really enjoy it, but also partly because I like to be abreast of what kids that I'm teaching are reading as well. So I read a fair bit of like YA and things like that at times. And one of the tropes that really annoys me is when the kids are all really clever and the parents are all really stupid, or the adults are all really stupid, which is really, really common, right?
Yeah.
And it's basically wish fulfillment on the part of the teenagers because they're reading the book and they're going, "Oh yeah, my parents are stupid." But it's so oh god, it's so unrealistic. I think I think really clever kids bothers me, or really like mature, like I don't know, when you've got like a 14-year-old protagonist and they're making all the right decisions and they're cleverer than all the adults in the room. And I'm just like, no 14-year-old is like that. No one in the world when they're 14 is like that. It's utter bullshit. And that's not to mean you can't have a compelling and interesting child or teenage character. Of course you can. But like there's a tendency to kind of Mary Sue them a little bit. Which bothers me. And whenever I read about it, I'm like, oh yeah, this again. Because I think that happens quite a lot.
I think a big thing with that I really don't like is that you get a lot of these books with teenage characters, and it's teaching kids that, hey, by this point you should be excellent at whatever the things that you're interested are. You should be falling in love with someone. You should be saving the world. It's like, you're 14. You barely know how to stand up straight. Just crack on with life. Don't worry about it. You're not in a post-apocalyptic future where it's okay that one of your boyfriend options is a crystalline vampire from space, and the other one is a dashing vampire hunter, also from space.
Sold.
Like, what do you do?
that leads me to another trope that I personally dislike, though I know a lot of people really love because it appears in so much popular fiction, in the kind of sci-fi dystopian space, particularly, is whenever you've got a society and they're like, so you're writing this dystopian story, you've created this future society or different society, and they're just really neatly categorized into like 5 cultural subsections of like as the builders and the fighters and the whatever, or they might just have different names or whatever it happens to be, right? But and that's the whole society, and everyone's categorized in that way, and everyone's happy with it, and that's how it all works. And usually, your protagonist doesn't fit in with that, but that concept, whenever I read it, I'm like, ugh, dull.
Can I ask, are you a Warhammer 40k person?
I'm not a Warhammer 40k person, no.
I was going to say, you just perfectly described a race called the Tau that have a builder class, like politician class, fighting group or whatever, and they are all just happy about it. And their most popular character is the one who said, "Hang on, this doesn't seem quite right."
Yeah,
So,
it's too simplistic, isn't it? Like it's
everywhere.
it's such a like simple way to view a society when we know from personal experience that humans are intensely complex, and the societies that they weave off the back of that are also infinitely and exponentially complex as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I totally
Don't be
agree.
wrong. Humans are really simple. On button is down between the legs. Off button is right behind the eyes. All you need to know.
All you need to know.
So, Nick, my dearest Mirror World Nick, if you could adapt any book into another medium, what book would it be? What medium would you go to, and why?
So if you'd asked me this about 5 years ago, up until about 5 years ago, or about maybe 3 or 4 years ago, from the age of about 10 or 11, my answer would have immediately been Dune. But that's been done.
Yes.
And really, really well.
Oh yeah, Denis Villeneuve.
So I can't even explain to you the levels of euphoria that went through me when I was watching that film, because like that was always my answer. That someone, like, I wanted someone to do a really fantastic modern version of Dune, and then Denis Villeneuve just came in and did it, and I was like, that's everything I've ever wanted. Like, you're amazing.
Just
don't
just
need
before
to
we leave
explain it
Dune,
to
I've got to
us.
say that my first experience of that movie, I saw it in a crappy theater that had like one of the speakers like was slightly dodgy and all the rest of it, but it completely transported me. And I was walking home with the people that I'd gone and watched it with, and we were discussing it, and I just sort of I kept on shaking my head like involuntarily. And eventually, someone was like, "What are you doing? Why are you doing that?" I was like, I think I've got to go back. I think I've got to go and watch it again. I think I've actually got to go and watch it again." And I
Yeah.
actually said goodbye to this group, and I went to a different cinema that had an IMAX that was a bit further away, and I watched it again that night. And
Amazing.
it, like, I have a great love for that movie, so I'm somewhat yeah. No, I really like the fact that you like that too. And I
That
think
was
Nick,
really special to me, but
yeah.
I can't say that because it's been done. So I've got to go elsewhere. And the next obvious place for me to go is I would love to see the Earthsea Quartet made into a proper live action. It's you can't put it as I don't think I think if you tried to make it into a film, it wouldn't work. I think it would have to be a TV show. I think it would have to be a high budget, like if a really high budget, thoughtful, like HBO TV show of the Earthsea Quartet, where you did each book as a season, would
I see it.
make me very happy.
Sort of take your
How do you
time with
feel
it.
about the Studio Ghibli Earthsea movie?
It is okay.
That's very political.
Yeah. Yeah. It is okay. I was disappointed. Partly because it's not like it's Tales from Earthsea, isn't it? It's not
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's not the books. I think I went in wanting the books because they're some of my favorite books ever. If I could only have one book of those books done, it would be the Tombs of Atuan.
Okay.
No question. I would
Why
love
that
to
one
see
in particular?
as a. I don't know. It's my favorite. Um,
Fair.
it's there's something about it that just captures me every single time. I love the language in it. I love the labyrinth underneath the ground, and the kind of, I suppose there's it's the one that's got the horror elements to it as well, which probably plays to my tastes a little bit. Um, yeah, I just love it. It's wonderful. I've taught it before. I've picked it as a book to teach, because it's just so beautifully written. I would love to see that book as an HBO like 10, 12 episode series would make me very happy.
I think it sounds like you've got a very lucky classroom of kids up in Edinburgh, my friend. Because the idea of an English teacher teaching you something that they love was something that was completely lacking in my early schooling. And yeah, I'm really excited that you chose something like that and then taught people it. That's
I
a
couldn't,
wonderful way to cultivate and shape young minds.
yeah, I wouldn't want to teach anything I didn't love.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful and thankful to be in a school and in an institution that's how they run. You know what I mean? They're like, pick the books you love and teach the books you love, like within a certain remit, obviously, because we need to do like exams and things like that. But it's quite free. There's none of this like you must teach them all Dickens, because I don't really like Dickens very much. But yeah, it gives me the freedom to teach what I love, and it's wonderful.
I have one follow-up question here, and feel free to say no to this, but could you give us some insight into how you're feeling about the optioning of Ascension? Because seeing as
Yeah.
you're talking about adaptations and such, I'm aware there's limited amounts that you can actually say about things, but yeah, any insight would be fascinating.
I am I'm thrillingly excited. Obviously, it's really exciting. I hope it gets made. I mean, it's I can't say much uh at the moment before things officially get announced. But I can say that it's been optioned by a pretty major studio, like Hollywood studio. You'd have heard of them. And it seems to be moving. Hollywood's such a mercurial industry, and things fall flat on their face for so many reasons at so many stages in the process. So it's hard to get your hopes up because, like, films look like they're gonna get made literally like weeks before. For some reason, they don't. But the people on board are really keen. They're really excited about it, and yeah, I just the idea of walking in and seeing it as a big budget kind of movie is it's just really, really thrilling and really exciting. And actually, like, I'm very hands off about it in terms of, I know I've already had chats with the screenwriter and things like that, and the director and blah blah blah. I know that they're adapting quite significantly, some actually quite core elements of the story, and changing them. And I'm very much like, okay, man, that's like you got some of the best adaptations I've ever seen are almost nothing like the book, and some of the worst adaptations I've seen try to follow a book too closely. I think they're completely different mediums.
That's true. Yeah. Yep.
You've got your faith in the filmmakers and the screenwriters and the people who know what they're doing to say this is going to work in a visual medium better than it's going to work in a literary medium, or vice versa. And so I'm just excited to see what comes out of it. I love
I really hope it happens for you, my friend, because from what I've read of the book so far, it's fascinating, and I think I would definitely go and watch it. So hopefully,
Cool.
Fingers crossed.
Me too.
So yeah, where should people start reading you then? So we know Ascension's coming out in April, at the end of April, but is that where you would point people to? Should they pre-order and start there, or should they start somewhere else?
It depends what kind of reader you are. So I have a previous novel that is up for reading, but it is, I would say, a little bit less commercial. I talked about it a little bit before. It's a little bit more niche and literary, by which I mean it's more pretentious. And if that's your vibe, then go ahead and read it because I'm proud of it, and I'm very happy with it. If you're looking to pick up a book where like that's a thriller, you're keeping the pages turning, it's really exciting, it's mystery, it's all of these sorts of things. Not that my previous book isn't mystery because it is, but like a more kind of commercial thriller style, I would say Ascension is the place to go. Not that Ascension isn't, I've put a lot of thought into it, and I think there's a very powerful story within the dressing of that thriller. But in that sense, I think it's Ascension is for a wider audience. Yeah, pre-order Ascension. Please do. It comes out next month. And yeah, that would be my recommendation.
So, if our lovelies want to find you online in these intervening weeks until they can get their dirty little paws on Ascension, where is the best place for people to find you?
So you can find all information about kind of my books and where to order them and where to get them on my website, which is nicholasbinge.com. Or the best two places I would say to keep updated as to kind of releases and editions and things like that is either my Twitter, which is at binge writing, or on my website you can sign up for the newsletter, and I send out a newsletter once a month. No more than that. I don't like hassling people, but at the end of the month, once a month, I set out a little kind of roundup of stuff that's been happening in the world of my writing.
Well,
Top notch.
absolutely. I really hope people do follow you because I'm very excited to see what you do next. And thank you so much for your time, for writing a story, performing a story, and letting us grill you about all and sundry. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, guys. Really appreciate you having me on. It's been great.
Lovely having you, man.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Tiny Bookcase.
Remember to subscribe, otherwise you're going to miss out on the future fun.
Also, tell a friend. If you like this episode, link them to it.
We'd be tremendously grateful. You can follow us on Twitter at BookcaseTiny, Facebook at The Tiny Bookcase, and Instagram at BookcaseTiny for updates. Speaking of supporting the podcast, well, magic can only take one so far. The Tiny Bookcase is supported by the generosity of its patrons. Those kind souls have really kept my belly full the last year. Let's cast a spell for them, shall we? For magnificent beardery, let's cast the Chinicus folliculale spell on Gary Laird. For rich ginger tones on the scalp, let us cast the Orangi Hedondo spell for Scott Byrne. And for general fabulousness, why not the Ooh La La, How's Your Mother spell on Matthew McLaren?
How do you come up with that shit, man?